Synth ratings. Yeah. Hello and welcome to this brand new synth ratings video where we will be looking at Vecto by Papen. This is a sister synth of Quad, which we looked at last time, so I'm going to refer to that quite a bit, so make sure you take a look at that video if you haven't done so already. Link above. Vecto is developed by Papen, and it first existed as a rack extension exclusive for Reason, but it was adapted last year to the VST format and AU and AAX as well. It is a sample plus synthesis vector subtractive synth. That's a mouthful, but that's how I would describe this synth. The price is $99 or 99 euros, depending on your country of residence. This is how the main screen looks in Vecto, and if you watched my Quad video or are familiar with Quad, you can see that this one is almost identical. You have the same preset manager up top, the filter section, amp, play mode, ARP, effect section, LFOs, envelopes, and modulation sections are similar, almost identical. The main difference is the oscillator section, which is quite different as it turns out. Instead of 2 oscillators, we now have 4, and instead of the 4 XY pads we had in Quad, there is now one big XY pad or vector pad in the middle. First, let's listen to the default preset. The default preset is a sustained moving sound, which gives us a clue as to the strength of this synth. You probably noticed that the moment I played a note, this little red dot appeared in this panel, moving around. And that is the vector pad in action. This vector pad is hardwired to controlling the volume of each oscillator. You can set this up here in the volume control parameter for each oscillator, or it can be used as a modulation source in the modulation matrix. Let's initialize the synth and take a look at each section in detail. But first, make sure you move to another bank or you will destroy your preset, which is very annoying. So big warning there. First of all, if you click this default preset, it will actually overwrite the file of the preset you are working with. And I have lost presets in this way, forcing me to reinstall the entire plugin to get them back. Not good. This is something I didn't notice in Quad, but it is the same there. Sound sources! Here's our default preset. Let's start tweaking some parameters. As is normal, the default preset has a simple wave, one oscillator activated, and the filters are off, no modulations, no effects, and so on. Let's try to spice it up a little bit. In the waveform section, you can select a number of different waveforms or samples. That's right, it has 2 different types of sound sources in each oscillator with different parameters. Let's see what happens if I select saw. The pitch parameters are active and the symmetry controls are active as well. SMA and SM speed is symmetry modulation and nothing else. So we can try those out. Here's a slight modulation going on there. Let's try a different waveform. These parameters change the shape of the waveform. If we select a sample instead, these parameters are grayed out. Instead, you have some other controls which become active, like reverse sample, which plays the sample backwards, and the retrig, which retriggers the sample at different rates. These controls remain active for waveforms as well, although I doubt that they do anything. You have an analog drift control, which gives you some slight pitch variations, and you have the normal pan and volume controls, as well as a routing panel to choose where to send your oscillator, which is not something you get in quad, and is a very welcome parameter. Keep in mind that Vecto is older than quad, so it's a bit strange that it has some nice features that were not included in quad, but that's how it is. There are 4 of these oscillators, all identical, so let's try to use them to complicate our sound a little bit. Fantastic. Now that we have our 4 oscillators, let's try to get the vector into action. There are several options for how you do that. You can first of all turn the vector on, then you can record a movement. Something like this will be fine. And then click replay. And it will replay my pattern. And by default, these vector movements will control the volumes of each individual oscillator. You see you have these 1, 2, 3, 4 numbers in each corner, indicating where the volume of that oscillator will be highest. You can also set up a delay. Let's say 1 whole note, which will delay the start of that oscillator. In this way, you can create some almost wave sequencing like sounds, although you are of course limited to 4 sounds. I will show you more about the vector pad later. I consider it a modulation source and I will cover it in the section on modulation. There are a few things more to mention about the sound sources first though, and one of them is the sync. I said that the oscillators were all identical, but that's not true because there is one button not present on oscillator 1, and that's the sync button. Sync to oscillator 1 enables you to sync the pitch of oscillator 2, 3, or 4 to oscillator 1, meaning that the pitch controls become more like timbre controls. Yeah, let's disable the vector. As you can hear, with sync enabled, the pitch controls do not affect the actual pitch of oscillator 2 because it's synced to oscillator 1, but it instead controls the timbre of the sound, almost like a resonant filter. Nice. You can do this for any oscillator except number 1. To round things off, we have this Ask Routing panel, which, as I mentioned, allows you to route the oscillator to one of the filters or to one of the effects engines, but it also allows you to route one of the oscillators to any other oscillator, allowing for some frequency modulation type effects. Let's try that with oscillator 2 routed to oscillator 1. Let's reset these since we're no longer synced. Okay, the volume knob seems to only take effect when I press a new key, but still you can hear that oscillator 2 is now affecting oscillator 1 in a very major way. It's no longer routed directly to the output, it's just used as a modulation source for oscillator 1. And that is frequency modulation. We also have a sub-oscillator for each main oscillator, controlled by this sub-dial. You turn it to 5 o'clock, and it's a square wave. You can see the volume changing up here. And the other way, it's a sine wave. A bit hard to hear, maybe. There it is. And that's all the control you have over the sub-oscillators, but each main oscillator has its own. So you can get a total of 8 oscillators going at the same time. That's about it for the oscillator section. Putting a score down for the sound sources, we have 4 main oscillators with pretty strong versatility in terms of what sounds they can generate. That is mainly due to the symmetry controls and the number of waveforms and samples that you have available. You have a nice oscillator sync for each oscillator and the hidden FM capabilities in the routing menu, which may not be readily apparent to anyone first taking a look at the synth. So keep those in mind. The built-in samples are short, but they do contrast the simpler waveforms nicely, and they sort of remind me of the way companies like Roland did it back in the 80s when they designed synths like the D50, which had kind of the same basic form of synthesis as we find in Vecto, with samples plus synthesized waveforms and a vector control. The negatives are that the sub-oscillators are very basic, but at least they're there. And like in Quad, you have no user waves available, but it's less of a limitation here since the range of waveforms to begin with is greater. All in all, I found the sound sources a little bit stronger on this one than in Quad, and it's a rating of 7. Filters! The filters are on the surface identical to the ones found in Quad, but given that Quad is newer, they have put some additional filters in there which sadly are not present in Vecto. And those are the new zero delay filters, which are, unfortunately for Vecto, pretty good. But we still have 2 filters, and we have 26 different types of filter to choose from. So it's still a pretty good selection. You have the variants of low pass, high pass, band pass, and notch filters, and you have the same exotic filters as in Quad, with comb, vocal, formant, and ring. What you can do here, which you can't do in Quad, is to change the routing a little bit. You have different filter paths. You can, for example, set filter 1 to go into filter 2, or you can set them to go to one of the effects engines, or just bypass the effects altogether and go straight to the master out. And the same thing for filter 2, except it can't go into filter 1. So you have a little bit more control over the routing here than you do in Quad, which is good. Let's try out some filters. You have control over frequency, resonance, volume, modulation wheel to filter, key track to filter, filter pan, filter envelope to filter. You have one envelope for each filter, so if I increase these parameters for filter 1, they are not changed for filter 2, they are separate. You have velocity to filter, and finally you have a vowel control, which only works for the formant filters. Let's try to choose something interesting. I like the comb filters here as well. Quite powerful stuff. And filter 2 can be maybe a low pass to keep that a little bit under control. Let's try to mess around a little bit more with the filters so you can get a feel for them. As in Quad, there is unfortunately no filter drive control here, but I guess for this synth, it's less of an omission than it is for Quad. And the reason I say that is because this synth is not geared toward EDM sounds in the same way as Quad is, which means that it's less dependent on aggressive filters. I like those special effects filters. I Miss the zero delay filters from Quad because they are newer and better than the standard filters here, but it's still a passable filter section. Let's move on. Rating the filter section, we have a good variety of filter types available to play with. As always, I especially like the exotic filters that you find here. You can get some wild results with those. And as a little bonus compared to Quad, you have better routing options available to you in this one. Moving on to the negatives, we still have no filter drive, which perhaps is less important than in Quad, but still something that you kind of want to have. Further, the older plain filters are perhaps not the most exciting and kind of hard to tell the different modes of low-pass filters apart, for example, but at least you have some varieties to choose from. One thing that is a big miss compared to Quad is the lack of the newer and better zero delay filters. We know that the architectures of the synths are quite similar and that the technology is available, and perhaps Rob Papen would consider adding those filters to Vecto in a future update, which would be one instant point added to my rating here, which is 6 at the moment. Modulation. Moving on to the modulation options we have in Vecto. I'll start with the basic stuff. As mentioned, we have 2 different filter envelopes. We have an amp envelope and 2 free envelopes, which have a couple of other knobs as well. They have the ability to sync to the tempo instead of being millisecond based. You can see up here they are now time signature based instead of second or millisecond based. So that's good, and you can also assign velocity or keyboard tracking to speed of these envelopes. All the envelopes in addition have this 5th parameter called fade. It's a normal ADSR envelope but with a fade parameter added. What it does is to fade out the sustained portion of the envelope. I didn't particularly like these in Quad, but at least here they are more consistently labeled. While I'm still not sure that they work properly, they at least make a little bit more sense. You have 2 standard LFOs, just as in Quad, the same 6 waveforms, and poly-free or mono modes, and sync options as well. I'm not going to go into detail for these modulation sources. The modulation matrix is only 8 slots big. You can't scroll here. If you try to scroll, unfortunately you affect the amount, which is something I do not particularly like, because the mouse wheel for me is something I scroll with. You can assign a myriad of parameters here. I think there are 59 sources and 194 destinations, including the effects, crucially. I always like modulating the effects on my synths. But the big feature is the vector pad. As you remember, we recorded this wonderful movement here. And you can actually look at your movement by clicking this edit button, seeing the different points of your graph, and you can edit them more precisely like this. You also have this command menu, which is also linked to the right click button. You can do a lot of stuff here. You can, for example, ignore my beautiful drawn pattern and set it to something more geometrical, like a circle or a diagonal line at some interesting angle. And of course, you can modify any parts so that you want. So now we have this instead. And that's how it moves. You can set the speed. At the moment it's set to a half note. We can set it to move a lot faster. It's a bit harder to see then, or a bit slower. Like that. And you can also have modulation to affect the speed. We can, for example, set something like the LFO to control the speed. Let's see if we can see that in the graphic display. Yeah, I thought I might see that slowing down and speeding up a little bit. You can smooth it out. If your points are very far away, then perhaps you will get less of a jump when you smooth things out a little bit. You can also quantize the movement of this vector. giving more rhythmical movements. And you can set the loop to start at different points as well. And then it will create this little loop. Let's speed it up a bit so it's easier to see the loop. And here it is looping around. So there's lots of stuff you can do with this, and you can use this graph as modulation sources as well. Just select X and Y. You also have unipolar options and a distance option. Let's use X because it's easy, and set it to control the filter cutoff, for example. You can hear the LFO affecting the speed there for sure. So that is one very powerful modulation source. As in Quad, you can also bypass individual modulation settings by making them red. It's a bit different color scheme here, but that one is now bypassed. Now it's not. I like that feature. It's a quick and easy way to audition your modulations, and it helps your workflow, which is always a good thing. So when scoring the modulation options, the vector section, which gives the synth its name, is an excellent modulation source for sure. We also, like in Quad, have this neat ability to bypass the individual mod matrix slots. And the fact that effects can be targeted by modulation is a big positive as well. The negative sides of modulation in Vecto is that you cannot modify buttons or menu settings, like changing samples, for example. You can't create a fake wavetable synth by scanning through samples with an envelope or an LFO. And I still can't make sense of the fade part of the envelopes. It just doesn't seem to work quite as it should. Take a look at my Quad video for that. But at least here they are consistently labeled. Finally, we only have 8 modulation slots, which is a bit on the low side, but might be just about enough for a synth which only has a single part. Had it been multi-timbral, it would not have been enough. In total, the modulation side of Vecto is a bit stronger than Quad, I feel, and the score will be 1 point higher at 7. Effects. Next on our list is the effects section, and it is identical to Quad in every way. I'm not going to go into detail about it here. I can add some chorus, ensemble, flanger, phaser or widener in Effects Engine 1. Yeah, let's bypass that modulation. In fact, the whole vector. And you have some parameters to play with for the different effects. Effects Engine 2 gives you delay and reverb. You can use them one by one or fed into one another. Let's use both, like this. So that's not bad. For this kind of synth, which is good at moving textures, pads and so on, having a good reverb is essential, and the new Papen algorithm does a good job here. Perhaps a little bit metallic, but with a little bit of low pass and dampening, it certainly gets the job done. Rating the effects, as I just said, it's important to have a good reverb on this kind of synth, and happily the plugin has this updated reverb algorithm found in the newer Papen plugins, which is a good one. The phaser and flanger effects are decent, perhaps not more than that, but they do a job. And compared to Quad, the routing is a bit better here, and you can route oscillators and filters more freely into the different effects. That's a plus point for sure. Just as in Quad, however, the widener sounds more like autopan to me. Perhaps it's just incorrectly named, but it's not what I expect from that kind of algorithm, and I don't find it super usable either. There is no choice of algorithm per effect type, and there is no equalizer. So in total, the effects section is not greatly improved compared to Quad, and it's the same score of 5. Ease of use. When it comes to workflow and ease of use, it is pretty similar to Quad here as well. You have a help button which brings up the PDF manual which explains everything over 50 pages. It's a good one. Further, you have this ECS mapping which makes you able to control different parameters by latching your MIDI controllers to them. Say I control this now with my modulation wheel, for example. I can save that mapping in a separate file and load it later. So you can set up your controller to control any part of the synth and do your sound design or real-time control without using the mouse as much. The right-click menu offers a lot more as well. You can set parameters to default, to 0, min, max, mid, a certain value, or you can set it to a random value. I wish there was a randomized patch option here, so you can set any parameter to random and thus have your computer do all your hard sound design work for you, but unfortunately that is missing. However, you have the options to set modulations by right-clicking a control. You set the modulation source here. It's a scrolling menu, unfortunately not nested, but since it's only the sources we are talking about, there are not that many to choose from. Had it been the destinations, it would have been a lot worse, but after all, it is the destinations that you are right-clicking. So that's a quick and easy way to set up modulations. One thing that I complained about in my quad video was that the velocity settings in the ARP was a bit hard to set. Somehow in Vecto the ranges are much more sensible, so I can set these now with no problems whatsoever. I don't know why they messed that up in a newer plugin like Quad, but sometimes those things happen. One more thing to mention is that you can set presets for your modulation matrix. There aren't any included with the synth, unfortunately, but you can make your own. And you can also use presets for the arpeggiator. If you click the Vecto logo, you will get to the back panel of the synth, where you can see a little bit about the version and, more importantly, set a few important parameters, like the screen size, where you have 3 different ones to choose from, the master tuning, and the tuning scale. Note this button here, which says computer keyboard up-down to change patch, which is always something I look for in a synth when browsing through presets. I like to do that with my keyboard arrows. You may be different, but at least here you can choose if you have that on or off. Overall, the synth is a pleasure to use and I have no major complaints about it. Scoring the ease of use category, I find that the VST GUI is a huge improvement over the rack extension. There's a good manual, you have these lovely right-click shortcuts for everything. You also have presets for the modulation matrix and the arpeggiator. I find the modulation matrix presets are a lot more useful than the arpeggiator presets, since the arpeggiator is rather basic. A few negatives, as mentioned in the walkthrough. Although you can assign modulation by right-clicking a knob, those menus are not nested in the same way as they are in the modulation matrix. And even though the delay and reverb can be used together, this feature was not a part of the original interface and it doesn't work perfectly, but it still works, and that's the important thing. The ease of use category gets a score of 7. Presets. I'm sure you've had enough of my stupid sound design attempt by now, so let's try listening to some presets instead. After all, this synth comes with a big load of presets, over 1200 of them. You can choose presets up here with these bank and preset buttons, or you can use the preset manager, where you can find the banks and the different sounds. You can set favorites, search by category, and so on. All of this is explained in my quad video, which has an identical preset manager. There are several banks included with different categories of sounds, or divided by sound designer. I prefer to see the edit page while I'm browsing presets, so let's close this manager and use the computer keyboard instead. Rating the presets, we know that all Rob Papen synths come with a huge load of presets. This is no exception, and I counted 1,289 of them here. The patches are well designed and perhaps surprisingly varied if you think of this as a niche synth for kind of pads and atmospheric sounds, stuff like that. Still, the best presets are, as usual, those who play to the synth's strengths. So you won't find a lot of dubstep wobble basses here, I think. The Bank Manager is very helpful for organizing your sounds, and it's also kind of an advantage that it works in the same way as in other newer Papen synths, so you feel right at home if you have used another of those plugins. There is a patch converter available for converting between VST and RE patches. It is not for quad at the time of writing, so as Vecto has been out for quite some time longer than quad, they have made a patch converter and it works. I have found only one third-party sound bank yet for the VST version, and there are a few banks out there for the RE which you now can convert. But there is not a huge amount of third-party support for this plugin. Unfortunately, I find that the presets are not consistent in output level, and that means that you can get a few surprises, because like quad, Vecto is a fairly quiet synth, but suddenly you get these patches which have a huge spike in volume compared to the others, and that might blow your ears off if you try to add a little gain after the plugin. So use a limiter there is my tip. Finally, a very important point I think is that there is this default preset button which instantly overwrites your presets on disk. So if you are happily browsing presets in the included sound banks and you decide to make a new preset, make sure you move to the default bank first, like I did in the beginning of the video, because you may overwrite those patches forever. The only way I have found to get those patches back is a reinstall of the plugin, and that's not something you want to do whenever you have accidentally overwritten a patch that you liked. Even with that considered, the presets are a strength of this synth, and the score in this category is a 7. Just as for quad. Features! Let's move on to the features. There is a reason why I stopped at this preset, and that is that it uses the chord mode. It has a chord mode, which quad doesn't have. You can have poly, mono, legato, or arp as well, but you can combine all of those with a chord mode. In this case, we have 4 notes being played. You can have up to 8. And you can select each note individually. And you can add a delay to that called strum, which can also be synced to the tempo. So in this case, we have a half note sync and 4 notes are being played. You have the root note, which is panned that way. You have note number 2, which is panned that way and is transposed up a fifth. The third note transposed up 10 semitones and panned all the way to the left almost. And the fourth note being panned to the right 15 semitones up from the root. So you can custom design your own chords and strumming patterns using this mode. The chord mode replaces the unison that you have in quad, so there is no unison mode on this synth. There is, however, an arpeggiator. It's probably not the best to use with the chord mode, but it can be done. It's pretty basic. It can be maximum 16 steps long. You can play different speeds, more octaves. You have different modes to play around with. You can set swing, length, and velocity. That's about it for the arpeggiator. As you may have noticed when we clicked the back panel earlier, there is a tuning scale menu down here where you can use the default tuning, or you can use any one of the included exotic tunings, or actually make your own by manipulating these tune files. So let's try the Turkish one, for example. Yeah, maybe disable the arpeggiator. If I play my normal C major scale using this tuning, there's nothing C major about that. So that works very well. Interesting thing to play around with. Rating the features, we have a few interesting things here. The chord mode with a strumming parameter that can be synced to tempo even is something that is quite unusual, and it is one of many small things that kind of play to the synth's strength, which is, in my opinion, textures, pads, and ethnic instrumental sounds. Having strumming, and not to mention the exotic tunings available for those kinds of sounds, are very useful. It helps cement the plugin's place in that niche. Was it really necessary to remove the unison completely? I realized that you saved some real estate in the interface by doing so, but if you added a small fine-tuning dial to the chord mode, so that you can kind of hack the chord mode into giving us unison instead, if that's what you wanted, wouldn't that be better? I like my unison sounds, and even though the synth is not aimed at big unison leads or anything like that, it's always good to have more options, right? The arpeggiator, as I showed you, is pretty basic. I don't think I would use that too much. This synth also uses Rob Papen's play mode menu, which had weaknesses in quad and still has weaknesses here, in that you can't combine mono or legato modes with the ARP mode. I think Rob Papen would be better off abandoning this structure altogether in favor of something else, or at least decouple the ARP from the play menu. At least in this plugin, the chord mode is decoupled. In quad, the unison was linked to the same menu as well. So it's a step in the right direction here, or rather, as quad is a newer plugin, it was a step in the wrong direction, I feel, when it comes to this menu system. The last bullet on my list is that there is no patch randomizer. I would love to see that here, because I'm sure the computer would conjure up some very eccentric sounds indeed. The score for the features category in total is the same as quad, a 5. CPU. It's that time again where we look at the CPU efficiency of the plugin. We can see that the memory usage per instance is a bit on the high side at 109 megabytes. That means you can eat up a lot of RAM if you use a lot of instances. As for the CPU usage test itself, it is done by playing a simple sequence of single notes, no polyphony at all, using different patches with increasing complexity. Start with a very simple patch, just a simple oscillator and a simple filter, no effects, no chord modes or arpeggiators or anything like that. And we find that that patch uses 0.23% of my CPU, which is excellent. If we add some effects to that, both engines in use, reverb is always on when the effects are measured, because that is usually a CPU intensive task. The CPU usage increases to 0.38%, still good. Next up is a more complex patch with all oscillators enabled, both filters, arpeggiator can be used, vector modulation will be used, and so on. We get results of 2.11% without effects and 2.26% with effects. We see a theme here that the effects are not very CPU intensive, and that may partly be due to the fact that they are not very complex. You can say that you get the effects here for a low CPU price. The results for the complex patch test is average. The next stage in our evolving CPU test is to add unison. In this case, however, we do not have unison, so we have to use chord mode instead, playing a polyphonic patch with a maximum amount of voices available to us in the chord mode, which is 8. 4.31% without effects. Interestingly, only 4.36% with effects, so the effects do not really matter at this point. However, that is a slightly disappointing score. When a plugin starts eating up this amount of your CPU to play a single note, or in this case a single chord, in fairness, you need to start being careful with your CPU. The final test is to take a selection of factory presets from different categories and averaging the usage out across those patches. I do not control if those patches use effects or arpeggiators or chord modes or whatever they use. It's just something that you would encounter during normal usage of the synth, and the result here is 1.01%, which is pretty decent. In total, the CPU efficiency rating for Vecto is an average of 5, which means it is slightly worse than quad and uses a bit more CPU. Overall results. Next up is the overall results, which is the category where I have the opportunity to give my own more personal opinion of the synth and give a score based on that. When it comes to Vecto, it is a plugin that I rather like. I've had it for a while in rack extension format, and it makes its way into a respectable number of my tracks. It seems I'm not alone in feeling like this, because the Vecto rack extension holds the highest possible rating of 5 stars in the recent shop. And I think one of the reasons for that is that even though the specs are not overly impressive on their own, there is a slightly esoteric feel about this synth, that it has this vast amount of possibilities. It's kind of the same feeling you would get from something like a Wave Station or a Roland JD800, both very popular, almost legendary synths. I'm not saying Vecto falls into that category, but it still comes together very nicely as a whole. One thing I do not particularly like with Vecto or Quad is that they are rather quiet plugins. Most rack extensions are compared to VSTs, and probably this wasn't adjusted when the transition was made from rack extension to VST. So I recommend adding roughly 6 decibels of gain, perhaps even more, because some of the patches are quite quiet, even more so here than with Quad. But then again, you have the lack of level matching on the presets, which means that some presets will suddenly be very loud. So make sure to put a limiter on there if you increase the gain. My score in this category is a very respectable 7. Money! It's time to talk about money, and at $99, Vecto is a medium-priced plugin, but it is part of Rob Papen's Explorer bundle, which gives you all of his plugins at the price of $499. There are excellent complete your bundle deals available if you own 1, 2, 3 or 4 Papen plugins, and you could, for example, buy Vecto for $99 or get it even cheaper on a sale maybe, and get the bundle for $299 more, saving you at least $100 on the bundle. There is a 1-month demo available, mostly fully functional, but after a month you start to get some crackles. As always, when mentioning Rob Papen plugins, the company has an excellent record when it comes to cross-grade offers, say between rack extensions and VSTs. They keep updating their plugins, as we have seen here with the ability to now use both reverb and delay in the same effects engine, which you couldn't do when the plugin first came out in rack extension format, and adding presets. Now there's almost 1300 presets here. That wasn't the case upon release. I have huge respect for Rob Papen for that. Not all plugin developers keep working on their plugins after they are released, so that is something to consider in this category as well, which makes the score in this category 7. Before we round this video off and go to the final rating for Vecto, I want to show this comparison chart with Quad, as they are very closely related plugins using almost the same interface and many of the same features and algorithms. For each row, I have highlighted the column where I think one synth has an edge over the other, and I think Vecto has the edge over Quad in the sound sources, modulation, effects, and presets categories, while Quad has the edge in the filters category due to the zero delay filters, and it also has slightly better CPU usage. Other things are quite equal, like the features, the price, and the ease of use. Hopefully this chart is helpful to at least one person. Final rating! It's time to wrap this up, and here is a spider diagram showing Vecto's strengths and weaknesses. These are the scores from all the categories we've been through up until now. Looking at the diagram, we see that there are quite a few good scores with overall results, value for money, sound sources, modulation, ease of use, and presets are all very good in this synth. However, it is bogged down a little bit by the effects, the features, and the CPU usage, which are all rather average. Putting it all together, we get a final rating of 6.3. which is 1 decimal point better than Quad at 6.2. 6.3 is just about enough to give a recommendation of good. Thanks for sticking with me this far, and here are some closing comments right at the end. I find Vecto to be best at soft moving sounds like strings and pads, ethnic type sounds, and it can easily be used in any type of world or meditation music, perhaps ambient new age stuff. Things like that is where I feel that this synth will excel. On the other hand, it's not as good as bass, I would say, and the lack of unison means you can't really do big leads or super saw pads or stuff like that. Overall though, I enjoy working with Vecto, and I am a bit surprised that it didn't score a couple of decimals higher. At least 2 to 3 of the category scores were strong for the rating, just not quite strong enough for a whole point increase. The same thing goes when comparing it to Quad. Vecto feels marginally better than Quad in many ways, although it is older, but not a whole point better. Still, Vecto is a good tool, even excellent in certain situations, and it just works well as a whole. I have no qualms in recommending it to you if you do those certain styles of music that I was talking about before, or if you're just interested in vector synthesis in general. That's all I have this time, guys. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.